we are actually the start, even though we come later, and they're going to figure this out. Because this is Dr. Stuart Bender, whose research focuses on the aesthetic and cultural impact of biometric media. So my discussions with Stuart, for example, have revolved around Westworld, which is not a series that I particularly enjoy at all, but that we've had a few conversations about because it does have that very high emotional content within it. But this time we're talking about virtual reality, rather than sort of film and TV. So in this, this is kind of, I think of it as the presentation of your book, which unfortunately we don't have any physical copies of, but virtually there is his book, written in association with someone else. And this talk is going to be about the way that the excitement around virtual reality technology comes with an idea often of techno-evangelism, which is actually something that we see a lot around all sorts of different hyped technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning. And in the past, we've even seen it around the internet, which is now here every day, run-of-the-mill tech, but something that people used to talk about in those terms. So I think that what Stuart's going to do is to raise some questions about that and kind of critically assess what's going on with the things that people say about VR, what's actually possible with VR, etc. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to turn over to you now.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and thanks for that introduction as well. That, I think, sets things up quite effectively. I will say that this book was written with my colleague, Mick Broderick, who some of you will know. He's now an adjunct at Curtin. But this is not really a book launch, but it's a showcase of some material that occurs in the book. So the idea I'm going to do is, what I'm planning to do here is apply what's in the book to a very specific case study. And I think this structure is both going to be maybe too logical and also potentially annoying. But we'll see how that goes. So I'm titling this Exploring the Claims of Techno-Evangelists in Relation to Virtual Reality, and I'll talk about what that means and who might not be a techno-evangelist. And I'm neither a techno-evangelist nor the opposite. I'm something else, and I'm not something in between. And the book is not something in between either. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people whose land we're standing on and recognise the strength, resilience and capacity of the Noongar people where Curtin University is situated. I acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. So this will be the structure. I'm going to introduce the idea of virtual reality techno-evangelism in contrast to what we'll call skeptics. I'll provide some overview of the methods used in our book, and I'm going to apply these to a recent conversation publication from both of us about the VR treatment of domestic violence offenders. Then there'll be questions and discussion, plenty of time for that. This note maybe needs to be said, this will not be a talk about domestic violence, and I'm not a domestic violence researcher and I don't know domestic violence statistics and so on, that's not my area. And we'll also be mentioning ideas related to military PTSD, so material will be discussed related to this in order for me to talk about the virtual reality application in relation to it. So the basic aim is to outline some key ideas from the book, Virtual Realities, Case Studies in Immersion and Phenomenology. But I want to do this by applying it to an article published in the conversation about domestic violence, specifically about an actual bit of action research taking place in Europe using VR to treat domestic violence offenders. But first, let me define what we're talking about, because I don't know, and it's impossible to know how much experience people have about virtual reality, and I need to define a couple of areas for the purpose of what we're going to be looking at. These are just some stock images of people enjoying virtual reality, but they're enjoying two different types of experience. The experience on the left is someone essentially watching a 360-degree video in a headset. It's essentially just a big video. You can do it with a very cheap camera, you can do it with a very expensive camera, but it's simply a video. And you put the headset on, you watch it, and you can look around. This has what's called 3 degrees of freedom. So 1 degree is you can rotate your head left and right, another degree is you can look up and down, another degree is you can rotate. That's all you can do. If you physically move, nothing will change in the headset. If you crouch, nothing will change. There's generally very limited interactive capacity. It might be that you could click and choose a different video to play, or maybe there might be what's called a hotspot, where if we had a video in here that was 360 degrees, you might get bored of this talk and you look over at the door and there might be a hotspot on it that you can click, and then that will trigger you now watching a video that takes place somewhere else. There are some more advanced interactive capacities than that, but in terms of you being able to pretend physically do anything to that environment, there's almost nothing. It's often used for tourism, training videos, so-called cinematic VR narratives and documentaries. We argue in the book that there's no such thing as a cinematic virtual reality thing. It is as far as you can possibly get from anything cinematic. But that has become adopted as a phrase. On the right, we have a person experiencing a different type of VR. They've got a headset. It's a bit more complicated, likely to be a bit more expensive, but these days, probably not. It's characterized particularly by what we call 6 degrees of freedom. So it has the same 3 degrees as you saw in the image on the left, or what the person's experiencing on the left, but it has some other degrees of freedom. You can physically move forwards, left and right, up and down. I'm not going to crouch here. So you have these additional degrees of freedom that you can move within the virtual world. It's very, very difficult at the moment for that to be a live action video. There's some experimental things being done, particularly by Adobe, to try and give you the capacity to kind of peak a little bit in a 360 degree video to give you maybe like a 4th or 5th degree of freedom. But typically these things are essentially created with gaming engines. And there can be varying degrees of photorealism. It may just look like a cartoon or a very simple game, or it may look quite photorealistic. There are going to be trade-offs with that, and what should characterize these experiences generally, or the best of them, is that there's a high interactive capacity. And it might be using controllers, like the person we see here has a controller, and they might be pushing the button. It could be aiming a gun, or it could be pretending to pick something up. They might be able to grip the controller to simulate picking up something in the virtual world. Or there's other types of augmented hand gestures and ways of tracking what your fingers are doing in the real world and sort of mapping that onto maybe like a set of virtual hands in the virtual world that might be something you can interact with. So those are the 2 types of VR that really we're interested in. But that's me talking about them. I'm going to show you a couple of examples that sort of simulate what you would see if you were looking at either of those. So this one on the left is from a virtual reality film. I'm not going to call it a piece of cinematic VR. And what I'm going to show you is what you would sort of see if you put the headset on. So I've essentially put the headset on someone, hit record, and then recorded what they are looking at while they're watching the video.
Hey Joe, both these cars have come up great. Your work on the Ferrari is making me look bad though.
So this sort of camera wobble that you're seeing is the person's head as they're moving around. It's not filmed with a Saving Private Ryan shaky camera.
Yeah, okay. Come on Joe, let's get onto it.
And something will happen. The person will look over and see this new information that's happening somewhere else in the world. And then they'll be reoriented to the title and so on. I'm going to gloss over this because I don't really find these types of experiences particularly interesting. But we'll probably return to some of this material in the rest of the talk. This is now the 6th degree of freedom virtual reality experience. But what's also going on here, a couple of things. Let me just pause it. On the right of the image, you're seeing a participant in a study wearing the headset and physically moving around the world and interacting. On the left, you're seeing what they are seeing. And so their right hand here is holding a controller. This is, on the left, a virtual simulation of their hand in the world. And at this point, they are holding a gun and shooting zombies. What I'm really interested in this is watch this person's movements and pay attention to their experience of this.
So what's up, dudes? You know the rules, though. Don't get too close. Hey, don't get too close. Guys, what did I just say? Don't get too close. Oops.
What you were seeing at the end there It was a little bit tricky to see, but there was a research assistant kind of making sure that she didn't walk through the wall and also grabbing the cords so that she didn't fall over them, which is entirely relevant because the video experiences are really easy. You can get a headset, it doesn't have any wires attached to anything. You can put it on, look at something, and just look around. Great. If you've got something like this, at this time we were making this, there weren't headsets that didn't have a cord attached to a high-performance computer. Now there are. The quality of them is still not as good as what was being experienced there, which is relevant. It's been like 7 years, and the quality has not improved. I would argue it's gotten worse. And there's a chapter in the book that looks at the degradation of a particular VR experience that was once only available for a high-performance PC, and then as soon as the cheaper entry-level VR headsets came about that you didn't need to hook up to a high-performance PC, the game designers had to modify and gradually degrade the graphics and degrade aspects of the gameplay and take things out. And that led to more people picking up the game, but less enjoyment and less sensitive immersion. Okay, so that's laying the groundwork, and I apologise if you knew all of that, but it's necessary for us to be on the same ground for what is about to happen next.
Hey, Joe.
Okay, so in the book, we begin by defining what we call evangelists and skeptics. And evangelists, as Eleanor told you in the beginning, we're familiar with these types of people, but they're now applying it to virtual reality. The evangelist position is that VR is more immersive. It's almost never defined what it's more immersive than. It's like a high school English essay where they tell you that this film allows a deeper understanding, and it's never clarified what the deeper understanding is or how deep it is. But this is typically part of the evangelist position. VR is revolutionary. It's unlike earlier media. It has more emotional potential than other media, and it blurs the line between storyteller and audience. The skeptical position suggests that VR will lead to more social isolation. VR is dangerous. That's a great typo. VR will overwhelm us with change because of its difference to earlier media. VR will be too seductive. And there's an emphasis on negative issues and topics in VR experiences, and that might cause trauma for people. Because it's rare to have a VR experience as something happy, or here's a cool place, look at it. You get a little bit of that in VR tourism, but by and large it's used for things like domestic violence, which we're about to see, or some sort of military experience, some sort of negative social issue. And so the skeptical position is that, well, this might actually cause trauma for audiences that are watching these things, particularly because it's so seductive and so immersive. What we argue in the book is that these two positions are fundamentally the same. They appear to be different, but they're identical. Both views clearly operate on the assumption that there is a teleological inevitability of mass uptake by consumers. So we've got to be worried because lots of people are going to be experiencing these things. And that the present technology is already immersive enough, or immersive to the extent that users feel that they are really in the virtual world and they have no capacity, presumably, to distinguish what they're experiencing from what they know is real. Both of these positions are essentially the same, which is why I said in the beginning, I'm neither of these, and I'm also not something in between, because there is no in between. So we have these two positions. However, over the process of writing the book, the skeptics have more or less disappeared. Almost nobody is a skeptic anymore. People seem to have just accepted, oh yeah, this is amazing. And that will lead us into this very interesting new study about domestic violence. Good. So the book, just to sort of, at this stage, I'm kind of done wrapping up what the book is really about, and I'll maybe summarise by saying the case studies that we have in the book, the approach that we take is to look at a series of case studies. And these include military simulators, action games, treatment for anxiety disorders, VR documentary experiences dealing with traumatic events, VR and empathy, and regulation and censorship of violent material in VR. Curtin does have a copy of this or has a digital copy, so you can access it if any of that piques your interest. And it's designed for you to be able to dive in and out. The introduction probably lays out what I just said about skeptics and evangelists, and then each of these case studies, if you're not interested in military simulators, you can skip that chapter. We draw upon, I guess, each of the case studies as we build it throughout the book, but you don't really need to read every single chapter. So this leads us to a recent piece we published in The Conversation called Empathy Machine or False Hope, How Virtual Reality is Being Used to Try to Stop Domestic Violence. What I'm going to do here now, this is the annoying bit. I'm going to do kind of a director's commentary of this article. So the structure is going to be, I'll read a bit, and then I'll tell you what we were thinking and why we were writing the simplified conversation language. So you get sort of the background. And if anyone's written for The Conversation, you're familiar with the process you go through. You have your complicated scholarship and research, and then you not so much water it down, but you need to figure out exactly what do I need to tell the lay reader about this. So I want to sort of fill in the gaps here and tease out a few other areas. So I'll begin the annoying part. The French government's just announced, this is now a couple of weeks ago, French government has just announced a trial using virtual reality to try to prevent domestic violence. There's been considerable excitement about this, as in the trial, with claims that the virtual reality experience is an empathy machine that enhances the perpetrator's ability to empathise with a victim's fear. As Australia grapples with its own domestic violence crisis, overseas companies are making noises about using the technology here. In our new book, Virtual Realities, we explain the need to be sceptical of these claims. This term, empathy machine, some of you will be familiar with because you're likely to be here because you've read something about virtual reality or read a lot about it. This term ended up getting attached to virtual reality in 2015 in a talk by an artist called Chris Milk, who made an interesting virtual reality film called Clouds Over Sidra that takes you, when you put this headset on, into a Syrian refugee camp and you see a day in the life of this girl. I forgot how old she is, but she's about 13, 14, 15, approximately that age. And in a TED talk, Chris Milk announced that when you're inside the headset, wherever you are, you might be in Perth, or you might be at a UN conference, or at a UN money drive, which is where the film was most successful. When you're inside the headset, you're looking around through this world. You see full 360 degrees in all directions. You're not watching it through a television screen. You feel her humanity in a deeper way. And this is the sort of language that became dominant for about 3 or 4 years, went away for a moment, and then has now returned in all of the media attention on this domestic violence experience, which just uncritically and unproblematically says, yep, it's an empathy machine. It's going to work because it will create empathy. This is the origin of that. And we see some descriptions of people seeming to have an empathetic response when they watch a film like Clouds Over Sidra. So this is someone talking about the film, and they say, during the short 8-minute movie, I seem to participate in their lives. Sorry, I should just back up. This is not the domestic violence thing that I have on the screen. This is the Chris Milk film that he made in 2015 that takes you inside the Syrian refugee camp. So someone says, during this short 8-minute movie, I seem to participate in their lives. I felt more connected and engaged to the story. Besides, I started thinking about how I would feel if I was in that situation. This story made me empathise with Sidra and her family. That's not empathy. That's feeling sorry for Sidra. Possibly feeling guilty because I don't live in that situation. It's not empathy. But this person's characterising it empathy because that's the language that's been presented by the VR community and the VR. I'll call them at the end ambulance chasers, but I'm talking about academics that have jumped into this field and really taken on the idea of VR as being empathy, empathy, empathy. This person is taking that received knowledge and applying that to explain their position. We'll move forward. What will the trial do? So back to domestic violence. The French trial will involve 30 men serving sentences or on parole for domestic violence. They'll be volunteers, wear a virtual reality headset and watch a 12-minute, 360-degree video. So remember the 2 examples of VR I had in the beginning? This is the first type, which is a video. You put on the headset, you look around and you see things. And you can see a representation of something that they will see. This is an actor, or we'll describe what he does. They'll encounter a range of dramatised domestic abuse scenarios involving a male and female couple and later their infant child. One example released by the French government shows a man who shouts abuse and points a knife menacingly at the camera, as seen in this promotional image. Other sample clips show the man threatening and assaulting his female partner. This is then supposed to trigger empathy in the perpetrators. And all of the media around this trial says it's going to trigger empathy. Put on the headset, you become more empathetic. This is some background to this. So unpacking this a little, we have in 2015, Chris Milk saying VR is the ultimate empathy machine. It's now 2021. We're saying domestic violence VR scenario will trigger empathy. Nothing changed over 7 years, 6 years. Chris Milk saying it's the ultimate empathy machine because you're in the world with the subject of Sidra and you experience what she goes through daily. I'm going to distinguish empathy in a couple of slides, but this is the background to it. In 2021, we've moved as far as saying the domestic violence VR scenario will trigger empathy because you're in the world with this violent man and experience what it's like to be threatened by him. So presumably, the intention of the trial is to take someone who is a violent offender, put them in a headset, they'll watch a violent scenario depicting a man being violent to them. And at the end of that, I guess, this person will no longer commit domestic violence. That's the intention of the trial. I'm not sure where the empathy, even if empathy happened, I'm not sure who he's going to empathise with. So let's unpack empathy a little more, because I've dangled this in suspense. So why do we need to boost empathy? Enhancing empathy is important, so I'm back to the conversation piece. I don't know how annoying this is. It seems to make sense to me, but we'll see. There's more to go. Enhancing empathy is important because violent offenders have been shown to have lower levels of what's known as cognitive empathy than non-offenders. This is the capacity to see a situation from another person's perspective and understand their emotions. This is different from emotional empathy, which is the ability to sense other people's emotions. It does not mean you necessarily share that emotion or understand why the person's feeling it. When I teach students about a range of things, this is the slide that happens when we talk about empathy and how people have an empathetic response or not to media. So the two types of empathy are cognitive empathy and affective empathy or emotional empathy. The first type, cognitive empathy, I understand your emotion. And you can test this with questions like, I can tell if someone's masking their true emotion, in a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. I can sense if I'm intruding even if the other person doesn't tell me. I'm good at predicting how someone will feel. I sometimes try to understand my friends better by imagining how things look from their perspective. This is cognitive empathy. You can kind of figure out why someone is feeling the emotion that they're probably feeling. You can be wrong, it's a guess, it's a prediction, but you have some sense of it. Affective empathy is, I feel your emotion. And you can test this with questions like, I'm happy when I'm with a cheerful group and sad when the others are glum, in a scale of 1 to 5. I often get deeply involved with the feelings of a character in a film, play, or novel. Friends talk to me about their problems as they say that I'm understanding. So again, we don't understand, affective empathy doesn't mean we understand why the person feels that way, or even how it feels necessarily for them to feel that way. We just understand, we just have an emotion that's kind of similar to them, and it's all about us. Remember the person watching Clouds Over Sidra and saying, oh, how would I feel if I was in that situation? That's affective empathy, which is completely different to a cognitive empathetic response, which would be, it made me understand how Sidra feels in that situation, which presumably would be the whole idea, but that person didn't have that response. They had an affective empathetic response. So violent offenders have been shown to have lower levels of cognitive empathy than non-violent offenders. So it'd be nice to boost their cognitive empathy. Let's track this argument. VR is the ultimate empathy machine. So this is the argument from people promoting this use of VR to fix domestic violence. And it's not just the French trial. There was one in Spain and there was one in another European country that I've forgotten at the moment. So there's 3 countries working on this and pouring money that could be used for other things into this. So their argument is that VR is the ultimate empathy machine because it makes you feel stronger emotions. Domestic violent offenders have less cognitive empathy than non-offenders. The VR domestic violence experience will make the offender feel strong emotions because they're putting on a headset, which will make them feel higher cognitive empathy with victims and or potential victims, so this will reduce recidivism. This is a pure techno-evangelical justification, which, as Eleanor indicated in the beginning, this is familiar from the marketing of basically all manner of other new technologies. We'll keep going. The growing buzz around virtual reality. In 2016, relatively low cost, though clunky headsets came on the market, making virtual reality a more mainstream technology. Since then, virtual reality has increasingly been suggested as a digital panacea for a range of psychosocial issues. This is the ambulance chaser stuff. This includes fear of things like heights and spiders and post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans. The capacity of 360-degree video to bring diverse environments to life is also being used to try to enhance cultural understanding and explore social issues such as racism. While many of these uses have been innovative and exciting, because I don't want to give the impression that I don't think this technology is cool. It is. And it's exciting, and the first time you put on a headset, it's a lot of fun. Does that mean it will do these other things? I'm not sure. So while many of these uses have been innovative and exciting, it's important to maintain a critical perspective. For one thing, it's no longer useful to label virtual reality a novel or experimental technology. We're not in the first wave of VR. It's been around for a very long time, but it keeps sort of popping up as someone discovers a new bit of tech that makes something easier. But this present wave has been going really since 2016, sort of 2015. You can't say that it's new anymore, and you can't say that we don't know if it'll work or not, or if it'll do this or if it'll do that. We know a lot about this technology. We don't know everything, but we know a lot. One of the things we do know is that it does cause very high emotion, depending on what the experience is. This is from a study from a couple of years ago now, where we had people play a VR zombie shooter, and you saw one of our participants in the beginning video. And we measured a couple of things. This is their baseline level of excitement and fear. So kind of their positive and negative emotion. When they were just sitting in the lab, not very high. They put on the headset, not very high. So just putting a headset on doesn't do anything. And then during the onboarding session, which is where they get introduced to this zombie environment, and they get taught, here's how you pick up the gun virtually, and here's how you shoot a zombie. Suddenly we get a pretty big improvement in fear, and an even bigger improvement in joy. So as soon as you start seeing things and doing things in there, it's pretty fun. We're going to put violent offenders in something that'll be fun. And then we take them through a different part of the experience where they go into an abandoned mine and they have to shoot zombies, and zombies are making creepy noises behind them, and then they don't know where the next one's coming from, and so on. And we don't see much of an improvement in fear or enjoyment. It's kind of the same as the first time they put the headset on. Yeah. So this is skin conductance, but we also measured using facial electromyography. So you've got various sensors on people's faces to measure, I've forgotten the names of the muscles, but they're sort of frown muscle and smiling muscle. But these results are from skin conductance, so sort of how excited you are. Actually, no, sorry, that's wrong. This isn't skin conductance. This is the facial electromyography. So you've got the headset on and you've also got some sensors. So in the abandoned mine, a little bit of an improvement in fear, but I'm going to unpack that a little more when I reveal what's hiding behind this panel. And then in the Horde mode, where basically you're trapped in a barn and you walk around and zombies just keep attacking, you've got to survive as long as you can. People were much more scared by that. They also really enjoyed it. So you're able to generate these kinds of emotions depending on what you get people to do. What's particularly interesting is this is looking just at the abandoned mine section. Actually, sorry, that's wrong. This is the onboarding section. That's almost impossible to see that line. This is the onboarding section, the first 3 bits of the bar graph. Then the middle here is a couple of chunks from the abandoned mine, and then this is their Horde mode. And what's really interesting about this is it's fairly regular throughout the entire experience, no matter what they're doing, except for one moment, which stands out pretty incredibly. And that's when they go into a dark room in the abandoned mine and they can't see anything. So they're not visually experiencing anything in the headset. If they turn around, there's nothing there. If they turn there, there's nothing there either. Because what's happening is they've virtually got in their hand a torch. They've been looking around. At this point, the torch stops working. And now it's black. And you can hear zombies. And if you turn around, the zombie gets a bit louder. But maybe it's there, maybe it's not. Maybe it's going to attack me. And you can sort of illuminate the area if you figure it out by walking around shooting with the gun. So you get a bit of light for a moment. You can see a zombie and where they are. That's the bit that people were really scared by. And they loved it, which is also relevant. So emotion's quite a complex thing when you're dealing with these sorts of experiences. Is someone just having a big emotion, and what emotion is that? And is there some sort of mixed emotional state? And is it useful to have those emotional states? In this case, it is. This is obviously connected to thrill seeking. This is why you like roller coasters, why you like scary movies and all sorts of things. Those things are connected. Are they testing these things in the domestic violence scenario? They might. There's no information about that, but I think it's highly unlikely that they're looking at how much did you enjoy watching this bit of violence. So what does the research say about virtual reality? So that's a study I've been involved with, but what else is out there? So virtual reality has been found to elicit strong emotional reactions, especially those linked to the user's own fear and anxiety. Some studies have also shown to a limited extent, virtual reality programs can increase pro-social behaviour that helps others. There's a key researcher at Stanford University, and I've visited his lab and seen everything that they've got and experienced their experiences. Key bit of pro-social might be the wrong word here, but a key project they worked on was you would get into a virtual world and you have a virtual chainsaw in your hand, which is just 2 VR controllers, and you virtually chop down a tree. It takes about 10 minutes to work through this tree. And then afterwards, on the way out of the lab, you have the option of filling out a paper survey or filling out a survey on the iPad. So it's a deception study. You don't know what you're doing there. And they find that if people come in and they do the virtual reality experience with the chainsaw, they're less likely to use the paper survey than they are to use the iPad survey, which must mean that this experience has increased their their environmental level of care. It's pretty interesting research, actually, but I don't know that it supports the sort of findings that are being supported. And it's also quite an old study, and that's relevant. We're using a lot of interesting background data to make pretty huge conclusions and potentially costly conclusions, whether just financially or otherwise. Sorry, I skipped a bit. However, studies have also demonstrated that virtual reality is not successful when it comes to the longer-term cognitive empathy the French trial is supposed to generate. Using both theoretical and empirical research, these studies have challenged many techno-evangelical ideas about virtual reality. So remember, cognitive empathy, I understand your emotion. This is the important one. The violent offenders have less of it than someone who doesn't offend. But VR has not been shown to increase that. Affective empathy, your level of affective empathy doesn't seem to influence whether you're likely to be a violent offender or not. But VR can really boost it. You'll have an amazing experience. You put the thing on, you're going to be excited. Or if it's scary, you're going to be scared. And if other people have said, oh my God, that thing is scary, you'll probably feel the same way when you put it on. But that doesn't influence whether or not you're likely to be a violent offender. This one does, and there is no research. Actually, there's some research that indicates a very weak effect, that, oh, you can sort of boost it. And theoretically, it would be possible to devise a scenario that might, but it would just be using traditional film techniques and other techniques from other media works to do so. And the typical VR, particularly a VR video, the typical VR video really doesn't benefit this at all. So we'll track the argument again. So this is the argument in favour, I guess, of using VR to treat the domestic violence crisis. So VR is the ultimate empathy machine that makes you feel stronger emotions. Domestic violence offenders have less cognitive empathy than non-offenders, and by doing this, they will feel higher cognitive empathy. However, the research would not indicate that that's likely to be the case. It seems like a strange hypothesis to make based on what we know from well over 7 years of research now. It would have been an interesting hypothesis 7 years ago. Would have been a great one, and probably worth the money because we didn't know anything. But now we do. I'm going to unpack eye tracking here, and I think, Kit, you were in this. Who else did I test? I don't think anybody else in the room I put in this. We'll see. This is a study from some time ago where we eye tracked people watching a VR video. So another key piece of research to consider involves eye tracking. And this, at the time, was just interesting. But now I think there's stronger theoretical implications that come from it. One of the most important findings of this research is that although virtual reality viewers are free to look wherever they choose, they typically follow the same attention patterns as traditional screen viewers. So the big selling point of VR was you put it on and I'm watching a video. Maybe you're taking me through an environment I can't go through, or maybe you're showing me maybe just a cool film, or maybe you're showing me some violent scenario that I'm meant to have a reaction to, and I can choose to look wherever I want. The storyteller can no longer control me. In a normal film, which is supposedly no good according to VR evangelists, in a normal film, if I want you to look at this character, I come to a close-up. And if I want you to think about what they're thinking, I'll come to a big close-up. And if I want you to think about what the person reacting to this person's thinking, I'll cut to them. VR mixes all of that up, and the audience can look at whatever they want. They're no longer being controlled by the filmmaker. However, they typically look at the same things that people watching normal films look at. If something moves, they'll look at it. In the example I gave you in the beginning where there's people talking in a mechanical garage and then you hear this gunshot off to the right, people then look at where the gunshot was. They don't ignore it or look at the ground. They typically look at that. And I'll demonstrate this with some eye tracking data. But the other key part of this is not just that they're drawn to movement, but they are particularly drawn to whichever character's talking. This has been shown to prevent audiences of virtual reality videos noticing other characters' non-verbal responses, which are crucial to understanding the events depicted. And I'll show an example of that. But first, what you're seeing here is like the big video. So when I said in the beginning that these types of VR experiences that are 3 degrees of freedom, essentially just a video that you put on the headset and you look around it. It's just a big video. What you're seeing here is it sort of stretched out. That's the roof, that's the ground, that's sort of behind you and so on. And when you put it on the VR headset, you just see something that's right in front of you, but you can look wherever you want. What you're seeing in the slides is the eye tracking data of where about 25 people looked. This is a relatively simple scene. This one, for example, where it's red, that means pretty much everyone was looking at that, and it's her face while she's talking. As we start to cool off to more like blue, that's sort of people who are a little bit more distracted looking around. But we're seeing here that no one's looking at the floor while she's talking. You're free to look at whatever you want in this video, but everyone's looking at the person talking. A little earlier in the film, we have 2 characters. Again, you can look at the floor if you want, but people look at this character, then that character, then this character, then that character. And so the blobs are indicating that pattern of attention. This is not one person. This is basically everybody that watched the film. Excuse me. I'm going to show you a clip from this film, and it really hones in on this last paragraph that was actually really the last paragraph. This has been shown to prevent audiences of virtual realities noticing other characters' non-verbal responses, which are crucial to understanding the events depicted. What I'm going to show you is, I'll come back to that slide. This is a simulated view from that film where I've figured out, okay, here is the average user watching the film. So this is typically what people looked at when they watched it. And I'll just actually play it and then discuss it. It's a short clip.
Next.
How's the interview going?
Yeah, excellent. Get ourselves a regular Kiri Haraguchi here.
A what?
Haraguchi. Remember pi of 100,000 decimal.
I wanted to pause on that frame, but I don't have that level of control over it. That's close enough approximation. I apologise the sound wasn't as loud as it could have been, but you could still tell that this guy was talking, then the female detective talks, and then the crim talks, and then this guy talks, who's a detective conducting the main interview. What do people look at? When she talked, we looked at her. When he talked, we looked at him. When the crim talked, we looked at him. This is not a very interesting scene. However, it's an interesting script, and it would be an interesting normal film. Because what's meant to be happening here, and it's completely invisible to the virtual reality audience, what's meant to be happening here is the detective's just talking, because what we want the audience to be paying attention to is the crim is recognising that the female detective was one of the thieves that he witnessed, and he's trying to figure out, does she know? And she's trying to figure out, does he know? And all of that is happening non-verbally. And the only way you can figure it out is by looking at it, but also the only way you can figure it out is by having cognitive empathy and figuring out why is he looking at her and so on. None of our participants saw that, which means none of our participants understood the film. They thought it was cool, they all rated it as awesome, but they didn't understand the story at all. And if I was making this in a normal film, it'd be great. I have this guy talking, and that's just a bit of soundtrack, and then I'd cut to the female detective, and then I'd cut to the crim, and then maybe I'd do a push-in. I've got all these great techniques, not just to amplify the drama, but more than anything else to point your attention to, look at him now look at her, now pay attention to the communication going on. But because I can't control that in the audience watching a VR film, I sort of can. How can I control it? I have to have someone talking in order to control it. So I can't do any of that non-verbal subtext stuff. I would have to have her talking about something so that we look at her and she's staring at the crim, and then I'd have to have him talk. So there's a lot that could be done that wouldn't make for a very enjoyable experience. But the key part of this is people only look at whoever's talking. That's going to be relevant in the French trial. So back to the domestic violence trial, we have users will be able, so users being the convicted violent offenders, because no one else is watching. This is also relevant. It's not like you can go and download this and watch it at home. It's very specifically used as a, I've forgotten the word for it, but as a form of treatment in the prison system. So users will be able to view the scenario from the perspective of the victim, the child bystander, and the perpetrator. Therefore, we would expect those in the trial to pay attention almost entirely to the perpetrator on show. He's principally the one moving, talking, and yelling. So if we have a sequence like this, and it's a little bit dark, but that's the crim, and so we must be here from the perspective of this character's wife. And he's being threatening, he's yelling at her, he's threatening and pointing a knife at the camera, so there's all these cool kind of depth things going on that the filmmakers are no doubt very excited about. While all that's happening on, we're looking at him. We're not likely to look at the onions on the table, I think, that are being cut up, or the background. We're likely to be looking at him. As he points the knife, we'll probably look at that, and then we'll be back to his face as he's talking. To the limited extent that virtual reality can elicit any empathy, a claim that's challenged so compellingly by the research, a viewer may only feel empathy in relation to what they're looking at. So even if it is the case that you can boost someone's empathy with VR, it's only going to happen if they're looking at the person that they're meant to have an empathetic response to. We're having an empathetic response to this guy getting angry and violent. We might even understand why he's feeling angry and violent here. That's an interesting perspective to have to take. So the viewer of the domestic violence project will be a violent offender who is likely to pay greater attention to the violent character in the virtual scenario. How will this prompt empathy in relation to the other characters who are unseen and their non-verbal displays of fear? The key idea, they're trying to boost, I get what they're trying to do, which is boost cognitive empathy, so that the offender can tell, this person is getting scared by what I'm saying and doing. That's the baseline, or sorry, that's the basic outcome they're aiming for, which I get, and that makes total sense. And the way they intend to do it is by showing us someone just being violent at us. I can see why this would boost affective empathy. They might be scared of this person. Great. But what if that has no impact on their cognitive empathy? So we'll track the argument. If VR is the ultimate empathy machine and it makes you feel stronger emotions, well, the research would suggest that VR can elicit strong emotions. These are not necessarily any stronger than other types of media. They can be, and there are interesting examples. There's a really interesting study which takes the traditional form of... Someone might ask me a question about this, so I'm going to try to give as little background as necessary to understand it. There's a form of psychological research called the trauma film paradigm, which is used to model the traumatic response from people. And the basic measurement of that, and some film people in the room will recognize the film I'm about to mention, the basic way that people do this is they show the rape scene from Irreversible. And if you haven't seen the film, it's a very horrific scene that's a long take, and you persistently watch the entirety of this sexual assault. And typically, researchers will show that to audiences and then track various things, like how often did you think about that over the next week, over the next month? How long did it take until you stopped thinking about it? Did you have nightmares about it? And so on. So they'll use this horrific sequence to essentially trigger a traumatic response in participants and then track how long until that goes away. And that's a useful form of research to model traumatic response. There was a group that found they tested one group using the traditional setup, and they had another group that played a really scary VR zombie game. And they found they were able to create the same level of fear and terror and able to get essentially the same level of traumatic intrusions over the same period of time by not having to show people a sexual assault. So that's potentially a benefit. It's got nothing to do with cognitive empathy and doesn't give any reason to think that this domestic violence scenario will work, but it's a really interesting positive outcome. Because obviously being involved in a trial like that would be pretty awful. Might be less awful and get the same response or the same results if you can just play a violent zombie game. Back to the argument, domestic violence offenders have less cognitive empathy than non-offenders, so if we can positively influence that cognitive empathy, that would be a benefit. However, VR has been shown to not increase cognitive empathy. So it's not even that it hasn't been shown to increase it, it's been shown to not increase it. The VR domestic violence experience will make the violent offender feel strong emotions, which will automatically make them feel higher cognitive empathy with the victims and or potential victims, so this will reduce recidivism. Well, the domestic violence scenario is likely to make the offender feel strong emotions because it's a violent, high emotion scene. If we show them just a neutral room and nothing happens in it, they're unlikely to feel emotion. So the subject matter is going to cause emotional response, no doubt. But this is only going to be in relation to what they see or look at, and eye tracking suggests that we can predict this is primarily going to be the violent offender. If the scenario has all three people in it, it has the wife that he's threatening, it has the infant child at one point sitting in a high chair that he's threatening, and then it has him threatening, we know from eye tracking studies that we're highly unlikely to look at either of the other two characters unless they are talking a lot, that he's the one doing the threatening. And most of the threatening and abuse in it is verbal. Eventually it becomes physical. And again, we're going to watch his movement. And there's a really interesting sequence from it where you can't see the wife at all. And he's just sort of dominating over the top of her. We're seeing his back. How are we going to have cognitive empathy for anyone when we can't see anybody's face? We're certainly going to be having a strong emotional response. Is that of any use? So it's therefore unlikely to influence their level of cognitive empathy with victims and or potential victims, and is therefore unlikely to have any impact on reducing recidivism. So our conclusion to this, and this is essentially my last slide, but there's one more that summarizes it. We know that virtual reality companies can see a market for their domestic violence programs in Australia. So people have been talking about this. It seems one of the limitations for its uptake to date has been the high cost of the headsets, although an appropriate virtual reality device is now available for under $500. So go back a couple of years and you needed to spend a lot more money than that. As we argue in virtual realities, policymakers should be less worried about the price tag and more cautious about the often unwarranted enthusiasm that can be generated by virtual reality. We all want to stop domestic violence, but we need to be careful not to simply buy into virtual reality as a solution because it seems new and exciting. especially if it takes resources away from other proven interventions. This is the conversation idea of ending things. You need to link it back to the country and et cetera, et cetera. What we're really saying there is that domestic violence seems to be just the next social issue that VR has attempted to monetize. It's attempted to monetize anxiety treatment and resulted in some really terrific outcomes there. But now, having dominated that, it's attempting to monetize other areas. And domestic violence is just the next one that it's attempting to monetize. So what's next? As I said in the beginning, when I made the skeptics disappear in a puff of smoke and then one reappeared in the room, the techno-evangelists appear to have won. Consumer experience has actually become worse since 2016. So the graphics have become simpler to accommodate the cheaper headsets, even if you're using something that's a more expensive headset. In order to enable cross-play between the various things, you end up with the degraded version. But their more expensive headsets remain more expensive. VR industry and VR academia continue to seek monetization opportunities using VR as if it's brand new. And I've been part of some. Using the methodology outlined in the book, I'm currently leading an industry-driven research project with 3 other major research projects collecting data at the moment. So I've been part of it. However, each time, I thought I had a slide for this, each time I've been attempting to take the approach that we foreground in the book, which is to look at what could VR actually do here? What might actually be of benefit? And not simply say, hey, let's use VR because it'll do empathy, or let's use VR because it'll be this or that. And that's meant sometimes changing the approach of the project to try to fit it into something that is actually likely to happen or likely to be of benefit, having experienced enough of these things and read enough of the research and looked enough at what people are saying about it, to try to actually make these projects not simply, it sounds a little bit like I'm probably being more negative than I intend when I say instead of it being an ambulance chasing project, which many of these things I really believe are, I'm interested in doing other things. So with that, we'll close it and it's time for whatever Q&A there might be. Thanks for listening.